The UN adopts an anti-racism resolution which is slammed by both the US Secretary of State for hypocrisy and also by activist groups for failing to mention the US at all. Also to come, France reopens many schools after President Macron announced a mandatory 2-week return to class, and a move that has shocked teachers and parents. And as Moscow eases its lockdown and asks for people to wear masks and maintain social distance, we head into the city centre to see how the rules are being followed.
It's the perfect place to test just how much social distancing is going on. In the summer, it's absolutely packed with people eating and drinking.
Hello there, good morning. It's Monday the 22nd of June. You're watching RT International, where it's just gone 10 o'clock here in the Russian capital. Now, the US Secretary of State has accused the UN Human Rights Council of hypocrisy after it released a resolution drawn up in the wake of the killing of George Floyd almost a month ago. Mike Pompeo also pointed his finger too at Cuba, China and Iran, where he thinks racial disparities are truly systemic. However, the UN document itself has also been criticised too by activist groups for being too mild. Murad Gazdiev has more details.
When the entire world gets this angry, this furious, something must be done. Rights groups and civil society have mobilized armies of activists and lawyers to make sure that it does. It's now or never. Here's that chance to get rid of xenophobia and make this world a better place.
The undersigned family members of victims of police killings and civil society organizations from around the world call on member states of the UN Human Rights Council to urgently convene a special session on the situation of human rights in the United States in order to respond to the unfolding grave human rights crisis born out of the repression of nationwide protests.
The ACLU and 600 organizations have written to the UN Human Rights Council to take action, to do something. Note that the United States gets mentioned specifically for obvious reasons.
You watched my brother die. That could have been me. I am my brother's keeper. You in the United Nations are your brothers and sisters' keepers in America. And you have the power to help us get justice for my brother George Floyd.
The UN Human Rights Council hears them. It gets to work on draft statements. It says what the people wanted to say, strongly condemns racism against African Americans and the structural racism built into the American government. It says it'll investigate abuses against African Americans in the United States. This is fiery stuff, powerful and righteous.
We believe the situation in the United States warrants urgent country-specific intervention and that a thematic global investigation is also in order.
What happened? Was it too harsh? Maybe an unacceptably strong stance against racism? They call racism bad names because those righteous words didn't make it into the final report. They were removed. Here's the watered-down blah blah version that they agreed on.
The draft resolution now before the Council requests the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with the assistance of relevant special mandate holders, to prepare a report on systematic racism, violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, especially those incidents that resulted in the death of George Floyd and other Africans, and of people of African descent.
Here are some of the parts that Washington convinced them to remove. No longer does America have a problem with a racist justice system. Now it's a common problem, see? No longer will the US government be shamed and called out for the murder of George Floyd. Now it's a global murder. We all, black and white and Asian and Arab, we're all potentially responsible for American police murdering a black man. The ACLU said it best. What a circus.
It is absurd that the final resolution passed by the United Nations strips mention of the United States, where police kill people, particularly black people, at alarmingly higher rates compared to other developed countries. The United Nations needs to do its job, not get bullied out of doing it, and hold the United States accountable. the country must face independent global scrutiny for its oppression of black people.
Witness the power of American diplomacy, the ability to bully the African group predominantly made up of blacks into watering down a statement against racism. The United States, which itself pulled out of the Human Rights Council, asked its friends, apparently, to do a little arm twisting.
It looks like backroom arm twisting is going down. The US, which quit the Human Rights Council, has successfully enlisted the UN missions of the UK, France and Australia to work together and undermine this important text. The efforts of the US to avoid Council attention only highlights why such security is needed and how far there is still to go to dismantle the pernicious structures of institutionalized racism.
Just one thing. If George Floyd's murder had happened in Syria or in Iraq, it would have been a war crime. That police officer knelt on a defenseless, handcuffed man's neck as he slowly suffocated, begging for his mother. And all those American diplomats, they would have been in the front ranks pretending to care, screaming and frothing for justice, only to deny that very same justice to anyone else.
Well, we heard from Hussein Abdullah, one of the signatories of the letter to the UN calling for an investigation into systemic racism in the US.
It's basically an insult to the Human Rights Council. It basically put doubts in the process. We already live in an era where values of human rights and civil liberties are attacked. And if there is a place where a human rights organization and people who want to see institutional racism end and racial discrimination end, that's a Human Rights Council. And if you cannot voice your opinion freely in the Human Rights Council without being affected and basically caving to the bullying and the pressure of the United States government and other Western government, that just show the level of mistrust we are living when it comes to Human Rights Council.
Now, while major corporations are throwing their weight behind the call for equality, it does seem that they are keeping quiet about their own overseas activities. Transnational companies have plants in Africa, the Caribbean and Asia, where people do receive less than their counterparts in developed countries. However, anti-racist campaigns do seem to overlook the big disparity in wages. We'll have a look at this in more detail a bit later on in the programme. Now, all French pupils, except those from high school, have to return to class today for 2 weeks of lessons before their summer holidays. Any attendance in the past month has been purely voluntary. The sudden decision, though, to make it mandatory has left schools scrambling to get back on track and in line with new norms and regulations. Charlotte Dubinsky reports now from Paris.
It is, of course, 3 months since France went into lockdown. Originally, schools were closed, forcing some 10 million students from schools of all ages and colleges to either learn at home on their own, or if they had access to computers and the internet, to try and learn through online classes, with a very mixed success rate at that. From today, schools now are meant to be reopening here in France after President Macron announced that just over a week ago. So the schools will reopen. There's going to be new regulations in terms of how they deal with the pupils. So there's been a slight relaxation of the health laws to allow this to take place. So let's have a look at some of the measures schools will now be putting in place to try and keep students safe from COVID-19. Well, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to continue a limited contact between students, between classes. In regards to how far students have to be away from each other, that's recommended to be a 1 metre distance, but that won't be put in place for the youngest children, so children who go to nursery schools. If that 1 metre distancing isn't possible, then it will be recommended that students and teachers continue to wear masks in those classes. Now, the government has called on parents to send their children back to school, saying have confidence in the system.
I'm calling on the parents to have confidence in the national education institutions. Everything is being done for the children to attend safely.
Well, some parents' organisations have also been welcoming this return to the classroom, saying it's good for students to be able to have that face-to-face contact with their teachers, to be able to mix with their peer groups. Also good for some parents who've had a real tough time during the lockdown and since schools have been closed in trying to help their kids with their schoolwork and their classes, particularly those who haven't been able to access those online lessons that were available. But some schools are actually outright defying the call by the government to reopen, saying they're not going to open their doors because they just can't put the precautions in place. And some parents feel like that as well. Unions have also been hitting out at the plans, as too have teachers.
Nobody asked our opinion. There is no dialogue whatsoever. Everything should have happened the other way. You have to discuss it first with all the parties concerned before bringing it up to the government level. It's outrageous when you hear such news from the press and not from the authorities.
There is an obligation to return to school, but there is no information on how the children will be protected. The same goes for children whose parents are at risk.
One poll found that more than half of respondents to that poll thought that it was a bad idea, and only around 45% of parents said that they were going to be sending their children back to school. In fact, as we've been stood here in the street this morning, we have seen a steady trickle of some young children being taken by their parents, which I assume will be going back to the classroom today. But really, there isn't that overwhelming support that you might expect for the idea of children going back. And with 2 weeks just before the summer break was about to take place, many parents may have already taken their children on holiday. So it remains to be seen how full the classrooms will be from Monday.
Charlotte Dubinsky in Paris there. Well, Nicholas Clear from the Teachers Movement, Red Pens, also believes there shouldn't be a rush to reopen schools.
Referring to a couple of hundred teachers who gave up as a sign of how 1 million French teachers feel is completely outrageous. Resuming classes now is pointless. By and large, yes, the minister is right. Every minute is important. But why then did he and his predecessors cancel so many classes and cut so many jobs? And now, in the midst of a pandemic, he says every lesson is important. So I believe that classes should be resumed in September. This is planned to be done in many countries. I don't think that collapse awaits them because of this. I don't think that Italy, Greece and Spain will be doomed if they don't start classes in June.
Meanwhile, with the number of coronavirus cases in Moscow slowly falling, the city has been easing out of its lockdown. From tomorrow, one of the last stages will be lifted, allowing all restaurants to reopen along with gyms and also swimming pools. However, authorities are still demanding that people do wear masks and maintain social distance. But with summer now in full swing in the city, Saskia Taylor has been finding out if people are actually sticking by the rules.
Moscow has come alive. Self-isolation has now been officially cancelled, so we are free to go where we want, hit the shops, get a long overdue haircut, I haven't made it yet, and even dine al fresco. But authorities have kept some rules in place. Masks are recommended and alongside gloves are compulsory in confined spaces. And let's not forget, of course, to keep our distance. So I decided to test whether Muscovites are playing by the rules or living footloose and mask-free. Let's go. First up, Gorky Park, one of Moscow's biggest and most popular outdoor spaces. It really has got everything: a museum, skating ramps, festivals, restaurants, and open-air cinema. But like all city parks, it was shut for over 2 months and people really missed it. So as soon as the sun came out and the city reopened, they flooded here. Now, I heard a rumor that they were checking whether visitors were wearing masks and gloves. So let's do some sleuthing. So here at the very main gates, there is a sign that clearly says, visitors to the park, please wear a mask. There's even a cute little diagram. Now this one above says that we need to maintain a social distancing of no less than 1.5 meters. But let's see if that's actually being put into practice. Now, I'm looking around and it doesn't look like there's any guard. Oh, in fact, there is a guard, but he doesn't seem to care that anyone around him is not in a mask. In fact, I can see I'm one of the few. Maybe they're just being particularly lax today because the weather's nice, but either way, it's not great. But you know what? Since we're here, why don't we speak to visitors of the park and see what they think about all these new rules?
There is little chance of getting infected on the street if you keep your distance.
Do you wear a mask?
I wear one. It's in my pocket.
Why aren't you wearing it now?
No one is wearing it here.
It's not necessary on the street because the virus doesn't live in this environment.
We have masks and gloves. Get them out.
Do you maintain social distance?
Yes, even now, I stepped away from you when you approached.
We must have antibodies because we've spent a lot of time with patients who've had pneumonia since it all started back in October.
Aren't you afraid of being infected without a mask?
No. I don't believe in coronavirus at all.
Okay, so we've patrolled a park. Now we're in one of the city's hottest hangout spots. It's called The Hole, for obvious reasons. And often you'll see musical and dance performances taking place, and in the summer it's absolutely packed with people eating and drinking. So it's the perfect place to test just how much social distancing is going on. And now the final stop in our patrol of Moscow. This area is called the Patriarch Ponds, and it's really developed a reputation for being the capital's restaurant mecca. On warm summer evenings, these streets are packed, as they are tonight. And while the waiters might be wearing gloves and masks, I can see that it's not top on the list of priorities of the diners. Now I really tried to get someone, really anyone, to speak to me. But apparently happy diners set free don't make for happy interviewees. Well, that's a wrap on our speed safety check of Moscow. And the conclusion that I've come to is that authorities can try all they like to keep people safe. But at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to change human nature, especially on a warm summer's day after months of being locked in.
Well, with life then for many in Russia returning to some sort of normality, a clinical trial for a COVID-19 vaccine has got underway in the country. The first report into the progress of the volunteers has been published by the Defence Ministry, and all 38 volunteers are under constant medical supervision and all are said to be doing just fine. Russia is hoping the vaccine can be rolled out nationwide by the autumn.
We help out the best we can. Volunteers were invited. Why not help? It was just an ordinary injection. I do not consider my act heroic.
I'm 100% ready, both mentally and psychologically.
Earlier clinical trials of medicine, including vaccines, were regularly held in our hospital. The necessary expertise of our medical staff and a well-established system will enable us to run a clinical trial of the vaccine at a high professional level. All the volunteers feel well. We did not detect any grave adverse effects following the vaccine injection.
Father, when will you come home? I guess in 4 weeks or so.
Do you remember about the Lego?
Yes, I remember. We promised it to you as your birthday present.
Or maybe when you come home?
Deal, but only if we will go all together to buy it.
Now, still ahead for you this hour, amid the global stand against racism, an investigation has been launched in Canada after doctors there were accused of discriminating against patients. We'll have the details just after the break.
Cannot be lonely with the app you like.
The world is driven by dreamers, shaped by thinkers and those with vision.
Who dares, thinks. We dare to ask.
Welcome back. You're with RT. Now, with the growing voices of the Black Lives Matter campaign in the US, major corporations have been keen to show that they are doing their bit. But with the spotlight firmly fixed on inequality at home, some firms will be hoping it doesn't swing further afield. Jacqueline Vuga explains.
A problem that's been ignored and shunted aside for far too long is finally being addressed in the US. Major corporations are shelling out massive donations, revamping their racially insensitive brands, and also tripping over themselves to apologize. And it's comforting to think that maybe this is just the beginning. Even the idea of reparations for slavery is finally gaining traction.
Now is the time to go big. And that's what I proposed in this $14 trillion proposal, to provide reparations.
The California Assembly passed a proposal to establish a task force to study and prepare recommendations on giving reparations to African Americans.
I know it has to be done now, and you know it too. Let's not wait. Let's do the study and decide whether there should be direct cash payment. But in the meantime, you know it has to be done.
But perhaps we should be forced to ask the question, how much of this is face-saving politics and brand activism, and how much of this is a real attempt to change a broken system? And maybe even more importantly, who's being left out at this point? Will this spur on reparations being paid to Caribbean countries as well, for example?
It is not enough to say sorry. We are not asking for anything as mendicant as handing out checks to people on street corners. The issue of money is secondary. But in this instance, the moral discharge of one's duty does require in a market economy that you contribute towards development.
And what about the exploitation taking place in Africa right now? Don't worry, Apple's on it.
Things must change, and Apple's committed to being a force for that change. Today, I'm proud to announce Apple's Racial Equity and Justice Initiative with a $100 million commitment.
Thanks for the equivalent of your spare change, Tim. But let's not forget that your company is one of a number accused of benefiting from child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Defendants Apple, Alphabet, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla are knowingly benefiting from and aiding and abetting the cruel and brutal use of young children in the Democratic Republic of Congo to mine cobalt, a key component of every rechargeable lithium-ion battery used in the electronic devices these companies manufacture.
Google and several other firms were also named in that lawsuit. And those two are pledging donations to fight racial inequality. But perhaps the lion's share of that money is going to be spent at home and not on their sprawling global and sometimes shadowy supply chains. Fashion is finding its conscience as well. The clothing retailer H&M is splashing the cash. Levi's, the same.
Today, H&M Group will donate $500,000 to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Color of Change, and the American Civil Liberties Union. We support these organizations in their efforts for justice, economic rights, and democratic empowerment. Let's change, together.
We're giving a $100,000 grant to the American Civil Liberties Union for its critical work in criminal justice reform and racial justice. We must listen to the voices of the unheard and join them so it becomes a lasting chorus that leads to progress.
And yet, just a year ago, people making clothing for them and other top labels were struggling in Ethiopia to live on just $26 a month. And yes, we get it. You can't just say it's all the company's fault. It'd be great if it were that easy. But competitive pricing and cheap foreign labor, that's the way of the world. And it's likely that those textile workers in Ethiopia might be even worse off if they didn't have those jobs paying them next to nothing. Just like there's no saying that those people, yes, even children risking their lives, want the cobalt mines to be shut down. What we're seeing is the structural consequences of colonialism and slavery. Throwing money at the problem is not going to cut it anymore. Taking down a few statues of racists isn't going to do it either. What's not needed is a cosmetic cleanup. Real change has to go much, much deeper.
The Canadian province of British Columbia has launched an investigation after reports of hospital workers playing a racist game. According to reports, doctors and nurses had been betting on the level of alcohol in the blood of Indigenous patients. The game had been reportedly called The Price is Right after the popular game show. It's also claimed it was not isolated to one facility. The region's health minister, Adrian Dix, was outraged by the claims.
If true, it is intolerable, unacceptable, and racist. And its effect on patient care is intolerable, unacceptable, and racist.
Indigenous people frequently suffer discrimination in Canada, including from its health service. According to the British Columbia Patient Safety and Quality Council, there are many cases when Indigenous people do receive delays to treatment or are even denied medical help. Procedures are sometimes carried out improperly without respecting a patient's heritage, while cases have been recorded too when pain relief has been withheld. We heard from Daniel Fontaine, who filed a complaint against the medical staff.
There are many different forms of discrimination. The one that has been highlighted this week relates to healthcare, obviously, but there are larger issues for Indigenous people around lack of access to proper housing, issues around poverty and economic development. There are a number of issues that are long-standing and go far back. But this revelation does highlight the need for us to take action and to move beyond just simply another report and more words, but actually taking action and having that action be on the front line. Canadians have been vocal for a long time about issues around racism. And when we're talking about racism in the workplace, clearly that is unacceptable. It's not something that anyone would support. When you're in a job and you are especially a public servant working within a public healthcare system, it is expected that you are going to treat absolutely everybody who goes through those emergency doors equally. And if you're not, or if you're incapable of doing that, then you should be removed from that healthcare system immediately.
And that brings you up to date. That's how things are looking so far today here on RT. We're back again at the top of the hour.
When all truths seem wrong, when all rules just don't hold, and a new world is yet to shape out, disdain becomes the etiquette, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground.
I'm Afshin Rattansi. We're going underground as the UK and the US, two countries seemingly sparing no expense to fight the pandemic, despite having some of the highest recorded coronavirus death rates in the world, enter a second round of trade talks while the UK's deadline to form a trade deal with the EU edges ever closer. Coming up on the show. Is neoliberalism and capitalist economics responsible for spawning deadly pandemics? We ask author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, Rob Wallace. And in a country ravaged by cholera, meningitis and yellow fever, how has a poverty capital of the world, Nigeria, so far managed to keep its coronavirus death count so much lower than in the USA or UK? We speak to Nigeria's top coronavirus man, the Director General of Nigeria's Centre for Disease Control, Dr. Chikwe Ihekwezu. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, US President Donald Trump may have placed the blame for the current pandemic on communist China by coining it the Chinese virus. But evolutionary epidemiologist and author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, Rob Wallace, suggests that it's actually capitalist greed that catalyzes deadly viruses. He joins me now via Skype from St. Paul in Minnesota. Rob, welcome to Going Underground. Just tell me, starting off, about how not just big farms make big flu, but your previous work, Neoliberal Ebola, suggests that capitalism fostered coronavirus.
One of the things that we get so programmed in is on the specifics of each of these viruses in terms of their clinical course and their virology, and that's all very important. But what we've done is we've lost the context in which a series of new pathogens have emerged with the 21st century. And each one of those is tied into land use changes and deforestation that's being driven by global capital.
And now, you're not biased because you had coronavirus. You wrote these books before you got it, but you contracted coronavirus. What has healthcare in the United States been like? Remembering, of course, that the United States has plenty of money when it wants to spend money.
Well, it's healthcare in the United States is just another form of making profit. So if you don't have the money, then you don't get the healthcare. Even under Obamacare, you have 28 million people who are uncovered, 24 million more who are underinsured. It's not the basis for responding to a global pandemic. The viruses certainly didn't get the business memo that they were supposed to cooperate with the profit system.
Well, it may have killed 100,000 or more Americans, but you're alive.
I am, gratefully, but not by dint of the American medical system. I, in essence, was frozen out of my doctor's office and had to be diagnosed online by a nurse practitioner who neither saw hide or hair of me.
And so, to be sure that this is not a background effect of neoliberal politics on the response to coronavirus, you're saying we need radical invasive change. That's not the lockdowns that we experience in NATO nations you're talking about. It's something else.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we do is we get so focused on the emergency responses, which are absolutely necessary, including the lockdowns, including whatever vaccines we're able to develop, though I'm not too hopeful about that. But the problem is our focus on the emergency aspect of it removes us from understanding or exploring the more structural issues that are driving the emergence of one deadly pathogen after another. At some point, we're going to have to come face to face and understand that our very mode of civilization is now driving the emergence of these deadly pathogens, and we have to foundationally break with that mode and develop a much more integrated relationship with Earth and our ecologies.
I want to explore some of those facets in a moment, but you're claiming that political power shapes both the infectious diseases and the sciences that study the diseases.
That's right. One of the things the science is an amazing thing. I'm not a scientist myself, an evolutionary biologist, but unfortunately, the history of science is very much integrated with the emergence and history of capitalism in such a way that science has been used as a means of decoding nature, but only in the context of whether or not it helps make somebody a profit. At some point, when we're confronted with problems that don't bend in that direction, science has difficulties with grasping and unpacking those phenomena. And so we find ourselves, and I think the pandemic is an excellent example of this, we find ourselves when confronted with problems that don't bend easily to commodification, then we are, in essence, unable to respond in a way that deals with the problem.
So what are we supposed to take from, say, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he repeatedly, and his ministers repeatedly, say we are following the science? So he's actually following a politicized neoliberal version of science, which is not the evidence-based scientific method at all.
Well, that's right. Well, science and capitalism have a way of pointing to each other for rationalizing their takes on things. And so we have a situation where many a scientist hired by the state or by companies are, in essence, putting models out that, in essence, support the system that brought about the pathogen in the first place.
So obviously we see Donald Trump often flanked by multinational pharmaceutical company and CEOs of big companies. But you, in your book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, you ironically do support Donald Trump in saying it's the Chinese flu or the Wuhan flu, because at the beginning of the book you say the WHO was wrong not to talk about the origin of influenza and other pandemics.
Well, certainly the Chinese do bear some responsibility for the emergence of multiple strains of influenza, of these coronaviruses, but China isn't the only epicenter for diseases. We have, for instance, H5N2, the influenza, avian influenza, they emerged here in the United States. We have swine flu H1N1 that actually did go pandemic in 2009 that emerged from outside Mexico City. We have Ebola emerge out of West Africa, primarily out of kind of the neoliberal interventions that drove deforestation and the spillover of these Ebola strains. So certainly the China does bear some responsibility, but this is a global problem.
You see, if I put on a hat of a CEO of a big agribusiness company, okay, I might blame the mining companies for deforestation, which, as you show in the book, is so intimately related with the spread of epidemics. But I'd say your book talks about big farms. This coronavirus is supposed to have come from a small farm, maybe a wildlife market. It's completely different to agribusiness.
Well, I would say mining does have something to do with this, as well as logging and in addition to agribusiness. But as far as coronavirus goes, it's a little bit more complex. But as agriculture, large agriculture intensive operations push their way deeper into the forest, it forces smallholders to relocate, and that also punches into the local forests, increasing the interfaces between smallholders and wild animals that are hosts for many of a new pathogen. The other thing to understand is that the wild food trade that everyone's pointing fingers at is not this kind of totally differentiated operation from big ag. Increasingly, capital is flooding into the wild food sector, and it's becoming more intensified in such a way that more traditional large agriculture is beginning to be modeled by the more wild food sector. And so as both those types of farming cut into the forests, you have an increasing interface with these wild animals and increasing spillover of these new pathogens.
So how are these interconnections exacerbated by something unprecedented in human civilization, the ability to travel vast distances quickly? We're only just putting a quarantine here at Britain's airports. What would you have said to Boris Johnson about the fact that our immediate response here in Britain was not to shut down the airports? I think in the US you had airports open too.
That's right. Well, the global travel network is it's the most integrated network we've seen in human history. Someone can go from one side of the world to the other in a half day or so. So it's any pathogen they might be carried can move that way. And that's the thing that's so shocking is the speed at which new pathogens might spill over from the deepest forest, can make a way to a regional capital and then onto a plane and to the other side of the world in short time. And here, despite the fact that we've left airports open, we should have known that was probably going to be the speed at which coronavirus was going to make its way in the other direction from Asia to the United States and in the other direction to Europe. But because of the kind of insidious nature of the pathogen and its clinical course, we chose not to act. And here in the United States, some of the studies have shown that COVID-19 was circulating in Washington State for 6 weeks before it was ultimately detected as to be circulating among people here.
Well, the numbers of dead are truly breathtaking in your country, obviously more than 100,000. As to the origin, you theorize that the pathogen may have existed already and it's deforestation that exposed it and allowed it to escape?
Well, there's been a lot of work since SARS-1 that showed that there are multiple strains of coronaviruses in bat species across central and southern China. And they had been spilling over into local populations, both human and animals, since then. If you keep rolling the dice, at some point one of them makes its way across into some combinations of animals, both wild animals and livestock, and ultimately into the humans, typically the labor that's taking care of the livestock, and then subsequently on its way to a local city. Most of those SARS don't make it to human, but every once in a while we do have one. And in all likelihood, SARS-1 and SARS-2 will be followed by a SARS-3.
And you really think that the logic of neoliberalism is that companies involved in deforestation and so forth, 1 billion dead is fine with them, so focused are they on profits?
Well, I mean, it's really easy. You just blame the virus, or you blame the Chinese, or you blame smallholders for cutting into the forest. There is, at this point, it's become, they've got these rapid response teams, crisis management packages involved in how to handle these outbreaks and make sure you continue to externalize the costs of the intensive production so that everyone carries the cost and everyone carries the blame. If you were to fold in the cost back onto the company balance sheets, agribusiness would be ended as we know it.
Rob Wallace, I'll stop you there. More from Rob Wallace, author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, after this break. Plus, we ask the Director General of Nigeria's Center for Disease Control, Dr. Chikwe Ehekwezu, why a country ravaged by previous epidemics, let alone IMF structural adjustment programs, appears to have dealt with coronavirus so much better than Britain or the USA. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground.
President Vladimir Putin.
Welcome back. I'm still with Rob Wallace, author of Big Farms Make Big Flu. The WHO arguably has never been more in the headlines. You give a very nuanced account in your latest book. China has just given $2 billion. Donald Trump appears to be withdrawing cooperation with the WHO. Do you think COVID may kill off the WHO?
Well, historically speaking, these kind of crises do have a way of killing off international organizations. We think of the League of Nations, World War I. So many these organizations are very particular and very conscious of the possibility that their fates are in the hands of not only the outbreak, but the nation states upon which they depend for their finances and legitimacy. In my view, there should be a WHO. But I think they're in the middle of being caught in something of a crossfire between China and the United States. In my view, the United States, as some of the world systems theorists have put it, is on the far end of the end of its cycle of accumulation. Capital's being turned into money. In other words, the American-based capitalists are, in essence, cashing out. And so what was previously post-World War II an exercise of political power, making sure the capitalist world system worked, including cleaning up pandemics of capitalist own making around the world, That's why CDC here was such an important part of responding to outbreaks worldwide. Well, that's been rolled back. In essence, in a matter of months, which is quite extraordinary, the United States has basically, in essence, washed its hands of its responsibilities to run the global system of capitalism, including cleaning up pandemics. China, on the other hand, sees it as seizing the opportunity. It's on its front end of its cycle of accumulation. It's turning money into capital, and it's interested in building empire and building infrastructure, including public health infrastructure, which will allow it to accumulate capital as the new imperial power on the block, as it were. Whether or not successful in that, however, it's up in the air. We are in deep environmental crisis, and we're arriving at a stage where Earth cannot support these kinds of cycles of accumulation.
You see, London hosted the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Boris Johnson gave a speech there. Bill Gates gave a speech there. We had the boss of it, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, on the program, and she said that it's no problem that these Western responses are big pharma lobbying to foundations like the Gates Foundation, and that actually, far from what you're saying, these, as we would call it, as many would call it, neoliberal capitalists and philanthropists are doing their best to save millions of lives, far from ignoring the risks of pandemics because of what they do.
For any individual philanthropist, they might be indeed encouraged or by good feelings and good intentions to actually use their money to help save people. At the structural level, however, once we are in a position to ask those from whom they developed or they got their money by virtue of, in essence, engaging in some of the practices that are promoting the emergence of these pathogens in the first place. I mean, if you're depending on those people to intervene in a way to keep those pathogens from emerging, then we're in some trouble because there's a conflict of interest in there. On the one hand, they are in favor of the practices that led to the emergence of these diseases. Even on the other hand, they're trying to use some of that money to intervene. I don't think philanthrocapitalism is the means by which we're going to fundamentally change our way of living in life and our relationship with Earth and our ecologies that we can stop these pathogens from emerging in the first place. If we're in the business of just cleaning up after one pandemic after another, then indeed I think we're in some trouble. It's highly likely that additional pathogens will be emerging. We're not going to have the 100-year delay that we had from 1918 on. And unless we make some foundational shifts in the very mode of civilization that we're operating under, we're going to be exposed to new pathogens in the future.
Finally, just to one irony, arguably, some of those companies obviously helping in the contracting of one of your biggest taxpayer-funded industries, the military. What do you make of the fact that after Edward Snowden, who sought refuge in Moscow after revealing mass surveillance, how that mass surveillance that bugs all our telephone calls has not been able to be used for track and trace for a pandemic threatening us all?
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think many countries have been using that in apps that have been used for better and for worse.
But not the NSA-CIA program that was revealed by Snowden. Is that being used to save American lives?
I don't think it is. I mean, certainly not in terms of being deployed to help with pandemic stuff. I mean, I don't think we would even consider the American response as anything organized at the national level. There isn't a national program for response to coronavirus here. It's all been devolved down to the local and state levels. In fact, the federal government set off a black market competition between states for ventilators. I would say I wouldn't quite classify the U.S. response as being even at the level of basic PPE and there is no contact tracing other than some a little bit at the local level. So if the NSA is involved in doing anything about coronaviruses, we certainly don't know it.
Rob Wallace, thank you. Nigeria has been called the poverty capital of the world, ravaged by IMF restructuring programs and epidemics. 40% of its population of nearly 200 million people live below the breadline, and yet coronavirus deaths are exponentially worse in Britain and the USA than in the UK's former West African colony. Joining me is the man leading the fight against COVID-19 there, the Director General of Nigeria's Centre for Disease Control, Dr. Chikwe Ihekwezu. He joins me via Skype from Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So we may have had above 60,000 excess deaths here in Britain with a population of 67 million. How come Nigeria apparently has recorded fewer than 500 deaths or so with 200 million people?
I think two things. I think it's very early to reach any conclusions around the burden both of infection, disease and death. Because, there's a time aspect that influences the transmission and also influences morbidity and mortality across the world. But there are also many things, whenever a new virus is introduced into a population, there's an interaction between that virus, the population and the environment. And, the deaths, fairly low death count we can see are not unique to Nigeria. The proportion of that are even lower in South Africa, even lower in Ghana. So there's definitely something happening on the continent, at least so far, that has limited the burden of deaths that we are seeing.
You say it's too early. Why didn't you stop all contact tracing systems in Nigeria like we did here on the 12th of March?
Contact tracing is very much part of our response. It's part of the DNA of any public health response to an infectious disease outbreak.
Well, that's not what we did here, though. That's not at all.
I can't really speak about the response in the UK. I can only speak about that in Nigeria. And, we are struggling too. We have resource constraints. It's a big, complex country, large population. And that was really why we locked down fairly early in order to enable the response. But there's no other tool that we have now other than, contact tracing and really the hard work that we do in response to infectious disease outbreaks, whether it's Lassa, yellow fever, monkeypox. And unfortunately, we've had quite a number of them. So we've really got ourselves trained into this capacity to carry out this type of work across the country.
You see, here in Britain, the media routinely says that the low death counts from the global south merely show that they may be lying about their statistics. The Chinese Communist Party invited you to Wuhan. What did you find there? Because China is always being accused of falsifying coronavirus statistics. I understand you never went to the actual Wuhan lab or wildlife market.
I didn't go to the lab. What my impression was in China is really at the time we went. I remember at the time we went, the curves were very much already in the decline. Is that, to implement a shutdown successfully, you have to have as much determination and resources to carry out, literally a deployment of food, resources, medicines, and everything else it takes to keep a population alive and active despite being shut down. And it was during that visit that I knew already immediately that we were going to struggle with something like this in Nigeria and, probably across the rest of the world. So that was immediately not a policy for me that would have led to a reduction in transmission, but a policy to prepare for our response and maybe limit and mitigate the impact of this. But, the reality, to be honest, this is a tough virus, the toughest I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I think the stories on the most successful countries will not be told this side of the end of the year.
Well, you stand by your contact tracing, which, as I say, the British government said had to be destroyed, that system, in March. They've now reintroduced it. Quarantine, which has only just begun in the past few days or so, months after the pandemic was detected here in Britain. Why did you decide to quarantine a UK-registered aircraft? Britain would never have quarantined a Nigerian aircraft.
I think we're used to a world where the narrative has been infections going from the global south to the global north. But the reality is that most of the infections in Nigeria came in from Europe, mostly from the UK. And not only by UK citizens, many Nigerians coming back that have kind of traveled between these two locations. But ultimately, and so it was, done as a public health measure. Ultimately, the measures that we have, there's so many contradictions. We're struggling with these decisions because each of them has a big economic impact. And that economic impact, especially in our context, also costs lives. And at the end of the day, if you remember the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, more people died from the consequences of the outbreak than from the virus itself. So we have to be very careful in taking the big picture into consideration.
You mentioned the economic impact. Money has seemingly been no object here, where we're paying 80% of wages, maybe a greater proportion of this population here in Britain is state-funded. Same there in Nigeria, because I understand the IMF okayed $3.5 billion for coronavirus. Some suspicions about where all that money is going. Some labs have not opened. What is the role of the IMF in this? And I got to ask, why doctors are going on strike there? I understand PPE was better in Nigeria than here, some reports suggest.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to really compare the economic realities and therefore the economic might to respond to an outbreak like this between the UK and Nigeria. We're really at different levels in our ability to do all of that. So yes, our government has really tried to reprioritize its financial resources for the response this year. Sometimes they've had to borrow. It's not an easy decision for any government, definitely not ours. In terms of the appropriate use of the resources, especially that with which is in my control in the National Public Health Institute, were brought up in front of the parliamentary committee responsible for ensuring appropriate expenditure, and we're being monitored very carefully. The challenge is that we started from a very low base in terms of our public health infrastructure, and we now have to build back better for the future. One thing is for sure, is that there will be more pandemics in the future. One thing is for sure, that countries are interdependent on each other, and more than ever, because of travel, because of trade, and we must work together to find solutions that can bring us together, because our mutual long-term existence is probably more dependent than ever on our ability to collaborate on areas that we've never collaborated sufficiently in the past.
Director General, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's it for the show. We'll be back on Wednesday, 3 years to the day. The World Health Organization claimed Yemen, ahead of bombing by British-made warplanes and weapons, had over 200,000 cases of cholera. Until then, wash your hands and join the underground on YouTube, SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.